The world's writers will walk through those gates, and if you hang around, you get a chance to talk to them.
I'm interested in conversations that deal with things that matter, but real, how do we live our lives?
First of all, make climate change personal in your life. The second step is get angry and get active. And the third step, and believe it or not, I think this is the most important. We have to imagine this world that we want to hurry towards.
It's about kindness is looking at people as people and not as I voted this, I do this, whatever it is. There's some people we will never get along with, but most of us are a complex mass of different things.
Hello, I'm Ian Rankin. I've been with the Edinburgh International Book Festival basically since day one. I went as a student, as a reader, as a fan of writing. Later on, I was invited to go as an author, which was a thrill. And it's a spectacular experience. It's a meeting of minds. It's a way to open your mind to new experiences, to new ideas, nuanced debate, entertainment, something for every age group. And that's what keeps me going back year after year after year. Long may it continue.
Hello and welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival. This event is called Healing the Digital Divide and is supported by the players of the People's Postcode Lottery. It forms part of the Citizen Programme, the book festival's long-term creative programme working in partnerships with communities and organisations across Edinburgh and the Lothian. And that programme offers local people a platform to share their stories and explore identity, connection in place, and what it really means to live in our world. I'm Marjorie Lotfi Gill. I'm a co-founder and the development director of Open Book, a shared reading and creative writing charity that works with vulnerable adults and the public right across Scotland in places like hospitals and with refugees and migrants in prisons and all sorts of settings. I'm delighted to be here today with Iain MacRitchie, the founder and CEO of MCR Pathways, an organisation that works with care experienced and disadvantaged young people, as well as Rich Thanki, the co-founder and managing director of Jangala, which has done many wonderful things, including putting Wi-Fi in the Calais Jungle. So thanks for joining me today. I thought that the place to start was maybe just to give a little bit of background about our organizations and how they came into being before we get into the discussion of what digital divide or digital poverty might mean. So why don't I start with you, Rich? Would you tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are and what Jangala does and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So Jangala is a charity registered in England and Wales. And we grew out of the volunteer effort to connect the Calais Jungle refugee camp and then onwards to provide internet access kind of across Europe and elsewhere in lots of displacement situations and many others that I'll talk about. But how Jangala began was really interesting. So at the time in 2015, I was working with Microsoft on projects in sub-Saharan Africa, which were looking at how rural and disadvantaged communities could use open technologies to connect themselves and their communities. And so, yeah, this was working in some amazing places in Kenya, Namibia, Ghana, and South Africa. And in that time, I got to spend a lot of time with people who are doing really innovative things in low-cost ways, because the main barrier to connectivity around the world is poverty. About 55% of the world's population use the internet, and that correlates almost perfectly with the 55% of the richest people on the planet. And yeah, this is why internet access stops at about half the population in lots of poorer countries, and at about 90% of the population in lots of richer countries as well.
Okay.
So I was doing lots of traveling backwards and forwards, and I at the time heard about some friends of a friend who were doing some amazing work in the Calais Jungle refugee camp. And they had started an organization called the Worldwide Tribe, and they were struggling hugely with getting internet access in the Calais Jungle. There was, it was on the edge of the town, but there was still really bad connectivity there. And my friend Ben, who connected us, said, well, Rich, can you help them? And so I thought, actually, this is something I can do. And so I put together a plan of how we could connect the Calais Jungle, wrote to one of my co-founders, Nils O'Hara, and within a couple of weeks, we crowdfunded donations through the Worldwide Tribe. And we were out in the Calais Jungle in October 2015, in amongst the mud and the temporary structures, with lots of people looking on quite amused. And we constructed a Wi-Fi network that covered the entirety of the Calais Jungle. And when we switched it on, because we only traveled there at weekends, because at the time I was also doing a PhD, when we switched it on, the effect that it had was amazing. We had 5,000 people, most days using the network, 500 people on connected at any one time. Lots of organizations who were doing distribution, education, learning, all kinds of other things, theatre, Dentists Without Frontiers, were making use of the internet, and it had a massive impact on the ability of the camp to function and people to help within that camp. And it was such a kind of huge thing that, we got requests from all over Europe and further afield whether we can come and do the same there. And so, again, we kept traveling as much as we could. And then we realized that actually this wasn't an efficient way of doing things. And we said, well, how can we make it easier for organizations working at the cutting edge to connect the communities that they're trying to help, that they're a part of? And so that's when we came up with an idea for a system called Big Box, which is a ruggedized thing about the size of a briefcase that can simply be put in the post and sent anywhere in the world. And we started making prototypes. And yeah, in early 2016, we sent out the first prototype to Greece to work with a mobile library there. And since then, we've sent 40 different Big Box prototypes, 2 different versions, to all over the world, from schools in Afghanistan to remote libraries in Nepal, to working with the UNHCR in Uganda, the International Organization for Migration in northeastern Nigeria, after the Lombok earthquake in Indonesia, and in so many different settings where you have people who are busy, who are trying to connect themselves, as well as the people who need assistance, but don't have the technical skills. And so kind of making that technology bite-sized, available, and making use of any internet access that's there has been kind of the work that we've done. And so that was what Jangala was doing, really, up until COVID-19 struck.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there, because we'll come back to the COVID conversation in a minute, because I feel that's changed all of the work that we all do. But before we move on to Iain, Rich, what's in the box? Could you tell us what actually goes out in the box?
Yeah, so what we've done so far is we've put together a lot of kind of open source components that kind of pre-exist. Our aim is to put it all together and create an integrated product, but only when we're ready. And at the moment, what's inside the box is a kind of a 4G modem, a powerful Wi-Fi access point that can connect 100 people by itself, a really powerful single board computer, so like a Raspberry Pi, but a bit more powerful, that can shape traffic and control the bandwidth to every single user downstream. And that much power can connect about kind of 5,000 people in total. And to the user, that's all kind of almost invisible. So a user in the field, say after an earthquake or whatever, will connect a satellite broadband receiver, turn on Big Box, and then Big Box will immediately broadcast multiple Wi-Fi networks, which will control the speed that users get, change priority between the team and who may need more higher priority and end users that may be given a lower priority, but basically allow people who are busy, have lots of other things to do, to just click a button and create Wi-Fi wherever they are.
Amazing. That's amazing. Great. Well, we'll come back to you in a minute. But Iain, do you want to give us a background of how you got into MCR Pathways and the story behind it and who you work with at the moment?
Yep, sure I will. But first of all, Rich, can I get a box? I mean, I'm sure you'll have a queue of people wanting to get
A few.
Absolutely. Ian. We've got them in 2 different sizes now, which we'll get to in a second.
Put me down, put me down.
Yeah.
Well, Marjorie, in answer to your question, I mean, MCR Pathways, well, I was business before I moved into, I guess, the third sector. And MCR Pathways was driven out of failure because I used to get involved in helping sort out businesses that were failing. Had a number of those actually around the world. But I did get the call one day to go into 3 care organisations, you know, an accumulation of 90 children's homes, 5 schools and a foster agency that was in difficulty. Went through the process and it took a few years to sort it out and got accolades for it and everyone thought it was a great job, but it made no difference to the young people. You know, and to this day, I could not come to terms with that. And that really drove the story of, well, how can we have a good organisation that had great quality of homes, but yet the outcomes for the young people were failing and continued didn't change for decades. Now, MCR Pathways was driven out of that, and really the only thing that I found with the team shifted the dial was education outcomes. So what MCR Pathways does is focus very, very distinctly on education outcomes to drive really good job choices and life chances. We moved from the residential side and I sort of parked all my business and I've sort of devoted 7 years full-time volunteer to try and make this happen throughout the country. And the journey's been now a little bit more than sort of around about 12 years, but currently we're supporting just under 2,500 young people each week in secondary schools. And that's where we had to go into mainstream secondary schools. And we put staff behind the school gates. They work with the young people when they come up from primary school. We then match them with a mentor, an external volunteer mentor, and also then start to help them find, grow and use their talent is the strapline, but it really is focused on that, to look and work with the young people to help them find what they really are good at and make sure their circumstances do not dictate. So we're on a journey. We're in Scotland at the moment, just about to open up into England, but again, let this model be shared and taken on by everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, and just in terms of what Open Book does as well, we're running shared reading groups, which are a bit like a book group, but you do all the reading on site. So you don't have to be able to read. English doesn't have to be your first language. You don't even have to pick up the text. You can just turn up and listen. You can have vision issues. You can have all sorts of other issues that might be a barrier to literature. But what we're really trying to do is use that literature as a tool to help people connect with one another. So it's really about getting people out who might not otherwise come out in conversation, and critically, the conversation doesn't have to be about yourself. You can talk about a character in a book. You can talk about whether you like the story, whether you don't. And then in some of the groups, you do a bit of creative writing on top of that as a way to just get people to make those connections with their own personal experience. I work a lot with refugee women, and I found that worked a lot better when we tried to get them to write something about their own experience, largely in groups, so they didn't have to pick up a pencil either. And then they would suddenly connect with the story and start sharing their own experiences and things. So we do that across Scotland, from the islands off Shetland. I think this year is our goal, right across to Stranraer and Eyemouth and places, in 8 prisons every week, in hospital settings, in libraries, in community centres, all sorts of different places, wherever people need them, and also for the public, because we find in the public groups, people who might not go out, because it feels a kind of low pressure way to be with other people. So that's what we do. And we do encounter all kinds of people in different stages in their life, but we don't work with young people at the moment because we feel that they have different kind of priorities, which I'm sure we can get into. But one of the things we wanted to talk about, or I wanted to talk about as part of this session, is this idea of digital poverty and what it really means. Because I think we hear about, or I hear about it in the news all the time, but then digging down, I think the definition of it has changed, because I always just thought it meant people who didn't have a computer, or people might not have access to a phone. And at Open Book, we work with an awful lot of people who don't have access to certainly a smartphone or a laptop or an iPad or any of those kinds of things, or their only access to them is through the community project or the public libraries or things. But I think digital poverty is maybe a bit deeper than that in terms of digital literacy or access in different ways. But I wanted to maybe ask you what you thought it meant in the communities that you work with. Rich, will we start with you again?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, this is something that we've come across a lot, which is that when we were talking in the early days about the work we were doing in the Calais Jungle, the response of some people was, why do people need the internet? Like, surely Wi-Fi is the last thing on the mind of a refugee. And it's a testament actually that we don't get asked that question really anymore. Like, I hear it less and less.
Good.
And the importance of it. So I've got a little quote here from a colleague of ours, Dan Tuma, who worked in Lesbos as a search and rescue worker, like literally taking boats that were coming in, often overloaded, sinking full of people. And he said, and we've got some camera, that people arrive crying and shaking with trauma. They're hungry, dehydrated, freezing cold and soaking wet. But the first thing they ask me for is not for food or water. They ask to borrow my phone, or if I have a charger, so they can call their loved ones to let them know that they're safe, that they made it across alive. They ask me for Wi-Fi. And it's this incredible kind of need that when you're displaced, when you're dislocated, when you're fractured, of being in touch with the support networks that make life possible. And that's not just people. I mean, in the Calais Jungle, of course, in lots of situations where we've turned on Wi-Fi to people, immediately people make phone calls and so on and do video calls with people. But then eventually they kind of, show other people around them about the footballing prodigy from their hometown who now plays in the German Bundesliga, or this is music that I love. Like, there's a whole web of things that make us who we are, and they don't disappear because we're a refugee. And, this is not even a recent phenomenon. One of our strong supporters, Christina, she, her experience is one of a refugee from the former Yugoslavia, and she was in a refugee camp in Spain. And she always said that the queues to use the 5 telephones were always, 10 times longer than the queues for food. So, that need to connect, that need to be connected is really important. And when we're displaced, it becomes more important than ever and less accessible than ever.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm with you. And I hear that myself with a lot of the people that we speak to. It's not just about them, it's about setting the people that they love at ease. So it's partly, they're relieved, but actually they're worrying about the people worrying. So you think back to days where, like, my father left Iran in the late 50s. It probably took his mother 6 months to hear that he'd arrived, because he didn't have the money for a telegram and he wrote a letter, but it took a long time. But now our expectations of that have changed. So if you haven't heard, that your kids made it to wherever it is they're supposed to be going, you start worrying, because our expectations of that have really changed. So I'm not surprised in the refugee context, and that's exactly one of the most important things.
I can just add to that, Marjorie, one thing, which is that there's the need for human connection, definitely. But another way in which digital poverty might be conceived of in this situation is that the refugee crisis across Europe was also fascinating, because a lot of the work was done not by national governments and big organizations, but by people, everyday citizens in Europe, getting together over Facebook, over WhatsApp, and just saying, hey, I want to get clean underwear to people living in refugee camps, which a friend of mine did. And what digital tools enabled is for people to connect in that kind of rich way and organize and create logistics. And in situations where there isn't Wi-Fi, that ability, that desire people have to help, it's blunted. It's not able to be expressed in the way it can be if you have that kind of tooling around you that can help you make the most of volunteers, resources, time, and effort.
Yeah, and even to add to that, I think it's not just about making the refugees this, when you hear these stories, but you can't see the images and don't understand what's actually happening day to day. So yes, that's really important for us to recognize that the life of a refugee in a camp isn't just about standing in a queue for water or for food or for the loo, but actually there are in some of those places teaching going on, community centers, and that allows people to say, hey, maybe I can send some books, or maybe I can whatever it is. So it's partly about shaping the lives of the people on the ground, saying, yes, I have this football prodigy, or my kid looks like this, or my granny looks like this, but also I have a life here and this is what it looks like. And maybe you out there could help us shift that in some way. So it's about projecting out, I think, as well as, showing who you are apart from just the journey that you come across. So, yeah.
I mean, I could certainly add on that too.
Please, yeah.
I think maybe a common theme going to emerge here. We've not even shared notes yet either. But if I tell you, the power of MCR Pathways is not about a program. It's about relationships between the mentor and the mentee. And I'd probably add relationship and connectivity both in the same breath. But for contrast, that when we have those relationships in place, just if I even give you the outcome, and this is all independent research in terms of young people going through the program that have a mentor, and our 3-year average of those progressing to university, college, and employment is 81.6% to be precise.
It's amazing.
The average across the country is 58% of exactly the same cohort. Now, the only difference, because we don't teach, the only difference is that relationship and that ability for that young person to connect. Now, obviously, I'm sure we'll come on to COVID, but once you pull away that ability to have a relationship, you must have the connection, and for me, I think I'm sure that'll be a theme that emerges from this discussion. The power of human relationships go way beyond, and at the moment we need technology to help facilitate those, particularly when we can't do it in person.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I keep reading about, Ian, and I know that you've put out a brilliant report yesterday, and we'll hopefully hear a bit more about that, but one of the things I'm really conscious of with teenagers in the house as well is the connectivity matters for the schooling, yes, and the schooling matters for their future. But what really matters at the moment is their mental well-being, and actually, it's that connectivity, whether it's usually with their peers. If they're not able to connect, then their own mental health declines, and then their ability to engage with education really, really suffers. So I think they're really connected. I think one of the concerns is teenagers just need this. They only need it for school, but actually I think more important in some ways, and I can say that as a parent, is the ability to connect with other people around them.
Oh, no question. I mean, part of what we've done over the last 3 or 4 months, not to use the COVID name again, but part of what we've done is we've gone through, because as soon as schools were locked down, we couldn't physically mentor. Clearly that was not the case. We then, in a fabulous team effort by so many people, lifted everyone onto a virtual platform, gave them absolute choice, whether that be just connecting in messages, literally emails, exchanging messages right through to video. Now, that's what really gave us the insight as to what is the definition of digital poverty, because we had that just shy of 2,500 young people. We didn't get everyone on. We're sitting just now with 1,936 because I count them. It really is that precise. Yeah. But what we found is that they needed to have the connection, so physically couldn't do it. And we put in kit, so we put in about 300 bits of kit. But I would say, without exception, it wasn't about schoolwork. So it really just confirms your point. It was about ability to relate to their friends, as much as anything else. And, behind closed doors, particularly for our cohort of young people, was just such a tough thing without connection. So the ability for us to help those connections was profound. And I think, as you said, Marjorie, we published the report yesterday, but it's given some really harsh numbers, with a lot of qualitative feedback and comments from the young people. We've had over 1,000 young people have responded in detail. And I think the process of responding itself has really helped them. But if I tell you, just under 70%, are feeling stressed, anxious, and low. So the mental well-being issue that has been caused is significant. The saving grace is connectivity and relationship, again, going back to those two words.
Yeah.
And maybe to add to what you've just said, Ian, I mean, this is kind of going round and round. I think there's so many areas of commonality, but the question of mental health amongst refugees, amongst asylum seekers is critical. I mean, the very process of being a refugee is incredibly damaging. It wears away at people, and you see it essentially. I mean, when we were putting the network up in Calais, we had an audience around us because we were a break from the norm. Like, what are these guys doing here on top of this trailer and putting up these poles and doing all this stuff? And people were kind of keen to help. And in Greece, in Lesbos, where people are there after the sea crossing, there, people had set up, organizations had set up special camps for vulnerable refugees. And And quite often, amongst those vulnerable refugees, there were people who were of kind of all ages, all genders, but the common thread was that people had suffered impacts and trauma, and those were real serious things. And again, where we implemented connectivity in the Pikpa refugee camp in Lesbos, which is about a camp for 300 people, the staff there, did talk about how, once that Wi-Fi went up, they did notice amongst people that some people who are feeling gloomy did brighten up because of that ability to connect.
Because it helps you be more human, doesn't it? We're by nature, who we are is based on who we know and how we respond to other people and connect with other people, even if it's just that we need a bit of time away from them. So I think when you take that away, you take away a kind of humanity of individuals. So yeah, and I know someone who works in the Moria camp in Lesbos as well, and all the services really come through WhatsApp there, because it's so big and sprawling, which I know is relative, right, to Kenya and other places. They can't find their clients. They literally can't find them. So the best way to reach them is lawyers are reaching their clients through WhatsApp. So they need that connectivity even to get services that help them resolve their situation. So yeah, I think that connectivity really matters, just in terms of practical engagement, but also in terms of feeling human. So should we move on, because we've talked about a little already about how COVID might have changed, the world for the individuals that you're supporting. Iain, how about you? I mean, I know you said that you've had this, you've talked about this report, which we've looked at. What are the young people saying in terms of their life shifts over the last?
I think, a key thing, and again, we're building on it, but a key thing is the very fact that we've asked them, because we were deeply troubled by, a lot of the recovery plans in education, or, recovery plans as a group of adults really didn't include their voice. There wasn't strong, and as ever, with those that are disadvantaged, their voice is not heard. I mean, it's not heard. It doesn't actually get the opportunity. So we were determined to change that. And, it took us 6-8 weeks of persuasion, of really getting individuals to want to. But what it's given us is fantastic, because it's given us the fact, the fact of the matter, if we put it down, there's serious mental well-being issues, but there's hope in terms of connection. 70% have not engaged in any schoolwork. Now, this is when you really get into the detail of, the digital poverty. They haven't engaged because half of them didn't understand it. They didn't have the human connection. The materials were just chucked online. Some were really good, and some needed to have a human, needed to have a teacher to be able to add to it. We had a quarter of young people that had caring responsibilities. So they're young carers, and you can imagine that kind of lockdown just increases the caring demands on them. So again, multiple reasons which we now have insight to, and even down hard statistics, even although there was a huge push in Scotland, for kit, for which we had more big boxes, I have to say, but for kit, we still found 15% is the number, didn't have access to something that was viable, a piece of kit or the kind of data access. But other things that were practical constraints, 20% of the young people surveyed didn't have the space to be able to do work. They were restricted, or again, very much in that kind of family setting or carer setting. So I think in the short answer, Marjorie, what it's given us is some really difficult things to contend with. A strong voice that's given us crystal clear clarity what we need to do for those young people. And as I think we've started off this session with, it just isn't about give them a bit of kit and everything's answered. There's so much more that needs to come with that, to make them want to and be able to participate.
Yeah, and it's not just about the phone, it's about the Wi-Fi, it's about the bandwidth. As we were kind of laughing, someone gets knocked off of a call so if you've got parents or a parent or a grandparent working from home, you'll never know how much time you get without, getting knocked off. So it's not just as easy as saying we're going to give you a laptop or a phone or an iPad. We've got to figure out what the underlying structure is. And then the literacy to deal with it and to use it is a different thing. We all assume young people can do things, and certainly in my house they can much more than I can. But I think the reality is there are lots of individuals, and not just young people, who don't know how to use the technology once they get it as well. So yeah. Yeah, and Rich, how has COVID affected the individuals you're working with in camps and elsewhere? Because you're back in the UK as well, aren't you, in terms of some of your work?
So it was a, the impact that it had on our work was well, our work. I should just say that we never go directly into a camp or a setting ourselves. We always work through partner organisations on the ground. I think we're humble enough to know that some people sitting in the UK aren't, going to know what's best for, a situation in an informal camp in Athens. So we had a lot of kind of really interesting projects that were kind of getting ready to go out. We had projects that were going to go to Uganda, to Sudan, to kind of other places, Ethiopia, and a lot of that work was put on hold because organizations started shutting down because of the risk to their staff, their volunteers, because of the safeguarding aspects they have to take seriously. A lot of organizations stopped providing services, schools shut down, learning centers shut down. And so in a sense, it kind of, in many ways, made lots of our activity halt. And so we were kind of left worrying for our partners on the ground, for the people that they were supporting. And it was quite ironic that in this world, in the area that we've traditionally worked in, that activity kind of stopped. But at the same time, from at that point, we were like, well, what can we, what is the need here? Because suddenly everyone's at home. There must be a great need for connectivity. And so we started making inquiries. I spoke to friends of mine who worked for organizations like St. Mungo's, who were working with people on kind of, people, vulnerable adults. So I talked to friends of mine who were teachers working with, kids in schools in, across London. And we realized that the need was huge, actually, that suddenly there was a double impact. People suddenly weren't getting those face-to-face services they previously relied on. Secondly, those places that people went to use the internet were often shut. Libraries were shut, cafes were shut. A lot of the connectivity web that people depended on disappeared. And, I don't think many people may be aware that I think it's 17% of UK homes don't have home broadband, fixed line broadband. And so in many of those homes, especially where homes which have like young school-age children, what kids will do there, and this is something that I've heard from a number of teachers, is that the kids in those homes will go home and they will use their parents' hotspot from their phone to connect. Now, data runs out and it's expensive, and suddenly people were wanting to try to do that all day, and things were simply kind of falling apart. And we noticed that other people were noticing this as well. So we noticed that on Twitter, the organizations were springing up saying, we need to get people connected. And so we thought, well, how can we be useful? And, Big Box is quite expensive, kind of bespoke piece of equipment that we've put together, but it can connect thousands of people. And then we kind of actually realized that lots of the things that Big Box can do, which is, make the most out of even kind of poor quality internet connections, block advertising, save bandwidth, downscale HD content to SD content so that you can get more out of the data that you've got, would be really, really useful in many of these settings, because lots of organizations have been giving out Wi-Fi dongles or MiFi devices, but then as soon as you give them out, they become invisible, they disappear. You have no idea if they're being used or they're broken. People don't have sometimes the skills to be able to use them. And so we spent 2 very, very hard months and very, very long days and very, very long nights taking the technology we developed for Big Box and taking that software and putting it onto a much smaller, lower cost device, which we call Getbox. And yeah, it's been a kind of a huge effort. We've been supported by our partners, and we've just started deploying these Getbox systems in a number of really, really interesting situations. The first one, which is active now, is at a shelter for vulnerable adults in Brighton. And there, there's a 32-room building which, has people in, from all different kind of backgrounds and experiences, all of whom have shared the commonality of being vulnerable to homelessness. Yeah. And in this building, there was no internet connectivity. And so you have all these people locked down, without the ability to connect. And so we've used 5 of our Getbox systems to share a connection around that entire building, and now that building's connected. And in 2 weeks' time, we begin a trial with the Clapton Girls Academy in East London, where we're going to be connecting 15 students from the academy and their families with kind of whole home Wi-Fi using Getbox. So the school will simply post a Getbox system at home. The family will just plug it into the mains, turn it on, put it by a window, and within a minute there'll be Wi-Fi throughout the whole house that can be used by all of the family members. And again, one of the things that's interesting for the school is that they want to make sure that that the girls are connecting, that their connection is active and working, and that's something that we can provide visibility on in a privacy respecting way, of course. And also they want to safeguard, so they want to make sure that the connectivity is available, but only up until 10 o'clock at night. So they don't, one of the things they're concerned about is they don't want to kind of exacerbate any kind of situations at home. So it's fascinating, and we've got a number of other pilots lined up, and there's a huge demand actually to get people connected. And something that I have to say I hadn't realized potentially. I mean, I maybe knew the numbers, but I didn't realize the reality of the lack of connectivity, here in the UK, where we assume that this is a connected country, a digital country.
Yeah, I'm going to add to that too, because in our experience, we were running 130, 140 sessions a month across Scotland in all kinds of settings. And we've been able to get some of them back online. I think 30 odd communities, different settings are back online, but some of them we've just really struggled to reach. And I'm not sure what the answers for those are. The obvious one are the prisons, because the men and women that we work with in the Scottish prisons every week don't have access to technology at all. They don't have access to the internet at all. They don't have access to phones, except in certain circumstances. And so the world just shut down for them. The education centres also shut down. So they were in their cells largely 23 hours a day with no access to anything except to television. So that was a really interesting challenge for us. And we're just talking now about how we might change that for them. And what's interesting is it's forced the prisons really to think about how they might allow access for those individuals, whether they give them each a phone that only has 4 numbers on it that are kind of pre-approved, or whether they have, how they deal with, they've said no to Zoom calls, which is how we run all of our other groups at the moment, but they've said, there might be other ways around linking them in on particular channels. And one of the ways we've thought about doing it is dialing up and doing a kind of old-fashioned conference call as a way of making people feel more connected in a very specific space. That's one of the things we've done with our visually impaired groups. They haven't been able to do Zoom, but what they've been able to do is dial in and have conversations that way. And the other place that we've seen a huge problem is in care homes, because they're completely shut, and we just can't get in there. And the technology, it's different, because even if you were able to give them the technology, the capacity to use it, if you have dementia or Alzheimer's or a whole raft of other things, is just one step beyond. I mean, we've been really pleasantly surprised as to how many of our users who are over the age of 70, who initially said we're never going to be able to do that Zoom thing, have suddenly, over time, have managed to do it, and that's been a brilliant positive result. But actually, there are still pockets of individuals we can't reach. The care homes being the obvious one. Prisons we were talking about today, and I think we will manage to get something through technology, but it's been completely shut down. And then the area that we found the hardest is domestic violence shelters, because they are, the shelters themselves, when they're in a shelter, we can reach them. But the organizations that support people living with domestic violence, you just can't beam into their homes, because their partners don't know they're there. So you can't suddenly create a reading group for women who are, even no matter how you badge it, there's a real danger for them. So that's been a really interesting kind of digital block in a way. For those are the groups that we've really, really struggled. Almost everybody else, including the guys who we work with at Bethany Christian Trust, who are individuals living with homelessness or have gone through that experience, have somehow managed to connect back in largely. We're not sure how they're doing that, because again, most of the people that we work in the community settings are coming to their community projects for digital access. That's what's drawing them. And one of the concerns we have is the reading groups are important and the human connection is really important, but also access to services, healthcare, food, their support benefits, all those things come through the internet now, and they don't have access to it. So we're not sure how that's been managed for them if they're not able to get onto the bank of computers that is sitting in the grass market or sitting in whichever community project they live in, or come to most days. So that's been a real challenge for us and a real worry. So we have real pockets that we haven't been able to reach, which isn't positive.
The good thing, I think our collective experience of what we've been through is it's shone a very bright light on those that don't, and it's clearly showing if they're not connected, they're left behind, and even more so because so much has gone online, and I doubt if it will come back. Even reading today about doctor consultations and various things that are likely to change and never come back to where they were. It does pose the question, and I'm pushing this, and we're pushing this as an organisation. I think we need to treat connectivity as we do a water supply, or as we do, it has to be actually a given, and almost, we need to, because I actually do believe, looking at some of the economics, that there'll be some big institutional cost savings on placing things online. That with it should come an obligation to make sure that those that don't have it. So maybe it's a lot of big boxes, Rich, but it's got to be equal. If we don't have equality of access, because it can be managed, I don't accept the argument of, well, they might do this, that, and the next thing. That's not our experience. Our experience is just not that. These things can be safe and made safe, but everyone should have the right to access. It's the biggest inequality, I think, coming down the track, unless we really call it out for what it is. And institutions are going to save money on the back of it. They should make a contribution.
And as you're saying, it's a gatekeeper to all sorts of services. It's not just one thing. It's a gatekeeper to health. It's a gatekeeper to benefits. It's a gatekeeper to lots of the things we just take for granted that are also those main services. Sorry, Rich.
So I was going to say, just to add to your point, Marjorie, just to economics, to culture, to education, to all kinds of things. And I think the words that sprang to my mind as you were talking, Iain, was the idea of universality. The fundamental systems in a society, are fundamental because they're universal. Universal education, universal health that we have in this country, that you look at other places around the world and you learn to value more and more. And universality cannot simply be, well, here's a voucher to get connected, or here's a device that will get you connected. Because if someone isn't making use of that, then they are suffering. There has to be custodianship, a kind of obligation of care that goes alongside this. And to the point that you were making, Marjorie, about the difficult to get to situations, those are exactly the situations we're concentrating on. We realized that we needed to make something that was kind of low cost, secure, built to last, and something where we work with partner organizations on the ground. So in our Brighton trial, we're working with a number of Brighton-based charities that were providing the whole wraparound of things needed to get people connected properly. And that's the way in which we kind of intend to work, which is, how can we find those situations where they're, how can we kind of empower these organizations to really help the communities they work with?
Can I ask you how you envision, and I wanted us to take a minute at the very end to think about, where do we go from here? What is there are no answers, I know, but what is the sort of, how do you scale up what you're doing on a national or international way? How do we, because it feels very local. And I don't mean local to Brighton, I mean local just generally, like you pop in and every user has a different need. So it's not like you can have a one box that will suit everyone. As you're saying, you need to send the Clapham girls a different box that does something different. So how do you envision being able to scale it up? Do you just grow the organization so that you can manage all those needs? Or how do we fix this, so that we can help lots and lots of people?
So starting with what we're doing specifically, and then maybe offering a few thoughts on what the bigger problem is. At the moment, we are kind of envisaging this to be a single box that can do kind of all of those things. It's got a 4G modem built in, but it can also work off the back of a fixed line connection and monitor that. So that kind of saves that particular cost but allows that for it to be monitored. Say, if you're using assistive technology for people who are older or people who have various disabilities. And it can be connected to kind of external antennas as well. So it provides a rural solution as well. So that if you were to pop, and that's something we haven't mentioned yet, so if you were to kind of pop a 4G antenna onto a pole, you can get a connection with Getbox in many places where you can't even pick up a signal on the phone. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a very kind of general piece of infrastructure that can be used in lots of different settings. But you know, we're a charity and we depend on donations to be able to fund this. And so the question becomes, well, how do we increase our impact? And so I have a few thoughts from this. So there is an organization called Operation Wi-Fi, of which we're a member as Jangala. And Operation Wi-Fi was essentially working to try to persuade the government to create a system of free Wi-Fi around the country. And after some initial interest, you know, we really haven't progressed with that. There have been some stopgap measures, but nothing kind of more concrete. And I think in the end, you know, if you have schemes that, lots of the schemes that we think of as being universal and national actually did begin in local areas with people making them work in local ways. So, you know, the NHS and the model for it, you know, Bevan was inspired by the North Wales mining communities and how they were creating healthcare systems for all of the residents of their villages and towns. And I think that's, in a sense, what we're trying to do, you know, in the sense that, you know, we are trying to show that we can do this in a cost-effective way, that, you know, we're not the only way of doing this. There are many ways in which this can be done. And we are using sources of funding as and where we can get them. And we're going to be looking for donations from corporates, from other charities and so on, just in a sense to show that what can be done. But you know, we are not the whole answer. And the bigger question is one of, I think we've already kind of circled around, which is, I think it would be very hard to sit here with a straight face and say that access to the internet should not be a universal human right.
Yeah.
No question. I mean, I think the message has got to be as straightforward and simple as that. It's like the water supply. It's just a given. We need to have that, because certainly, you know, those that are disadvantaged are being further disadvantaged. And I see that path continuing unless we arrest it and say access, use your words, Ritz, is universal. Lots of big boxes, lots of any shapes of boxes you can come up with, but it should just be universal, full stop.
Yeah.
And we need to try and then encourage, I guess, the platforms and the various of arms races that goes on with technology, just to, you know, keep the user in mind. You know, we don't need to keep, you know, because we want to keep everyone on the same pace of it. But, you know, for our young people, we can see immediately those, based on their access, that progress. And, you know, for us, we've just got to keep picking off the areas, as you say, that don't have, to help and support them to get. But from a policy point of view, everyone should get it, full stop.
And your view, Iain, is that the answer to that is to make sure all the young people that you're working with in particular have access, you know, just as a ground, as a given.
It's an absolute given. You know, I think, you know, some of our young people, you know, I'd like to look at it as a badge, you know, a disadvantage badge is a badge that's going to get you stuff. So it's just going to mean you get a mentor, you get support, because we'll give you every opportunity to realize your potential, full stop. You know,
And it's not just as much of that, it's a lot of navigating through what's available. I mean, I know that even me, you know, who's pretty literate on a computer, has spent a lot of time navigating all the stuff that's available online and which events you want to go to, what you want to take part in, because there's so much available, which is terrific, and so much available that's free, which feels very democratic, you know, and it's wonderful. But actually there's time and energy and some experience needed to help support those of us who are new or learning as well. So it's not just a case of giving someone a laptop and say, or a Mac or an iPad and saying, here you go, or an older person and saying, well, there you are, you're sorted. It's a lot of time and energy. So it's not just the top level. I think there's quite a lot of filtering down. And
I agree. I mean, one of the things we do have a laugh actually with it, but what we always say is the young person, it's like our mentor relationships. The young person is the judge. Whether the mentor's any good, because, you know, their outcome dictates, but they always give us that feedback. I think we need to reverse some of the chat, because, you know, I've heard institutions saying, or, you know, government, right, we've given 25,000 laptops. It's like, I'll tell you what, let's reverse that round. I'm going to ask the 25,000 recipients, was it any good?
Yep.
Did it work? I think we have to invert it, and they tell us if it succeeded or not, and we do exactly what it takes to be able to get them up and running. You know, some of our young people, for example, you know, we had to do, and I wish I'd met you before, Rich, but we had to look at, well, there's no chance of getting any Wi-Fi access there in terms of, so we did do the 4G dongle, had to fit it as a rural setting, but then have, you know, a member of staff online on call to help them get up and running, give it a go, see what it's like. And we've gone back and say, was it any good? And they are the judge. The user needs to be the judge, not the giver. And I think that's the fundamental difference.
And I mean, just to maybe kind of add to that point, and that's a really interesting point, Ian, and I'd love to know more about that experience kind of offline, is that, again, I mean, to take it back internationally, you know, the internet is important in the UK now during COVID, but it's kind of important around the world. And you know, if I had time, I would tell you about some of the amazing things that I saw in Kenya and other places that happened when people got connected and connected themselves. And it's important to turn it around, because you know, the internet is an amazing thing in that it is not a centrally controlled thing. The internet is a protocol. You know, if the world, you know, reverted back to kind of Stone Age conditions tomorrow, if the three of us were to set up IP links between ourselves and make services available, that would be the internet popping back up again. It is a truly kind of remarkable thing. And locality is at the heart of the internet. And it's been lost in this era of Google and Facebook and huge cloud providers and governments snooping on what you're doing, and I don't know, hacking groups from all over the world, you know, snooping on what the governments are doing. We forget that it's fundamentally a kind of local thing. And so allowing people to have the knowledge to connect themselves and their communities to, you know, make that connectivity work for them is really what we've been trying to build. And it applies in so many settings. And there's something about that, which is empowering people to build and manage and own their own infrastructure is possibly the most empowering thing you can do.
Definitely. Yeah. And for me, that's a classic marry of policy with practice, to say, right, policy, you've done your bit, we're going to tell you if it was any good or not. And it's the users that are going to say, not the giver. The giver's got to just shut up actually and let the user say if it was good or bad.
Yeah, and choose how they use it and choose what they use it for, not say we're giving you this so that you can do this with it. What we want is to give it to you so that you can develop your own idea of how you want to be and what you want to do with it and how you want to live your life and how it's going to benefit you. Because as you said, Rich, we're often the wrong people to tell others what it is that they need and want to make their lives better or more interesting or more valuable to them, to themselves and their families. So,
and I'll give you a classic. Sorry, Rich, a classic, that the case in point that we're still laughing at from the survey that we did, asking young people, you know, over 40%, and this is not us going back to the dark ages of no online, but 42% to be precise, wanted the online learning from school, but then wanted some paper to back it up. So they wanted paperwork so they could work on it when the times that the internet didn't work. Okay, that's them saying, look, this is how I need it. And what we've said is, no problem, we'll just make sure you get access and then we'll give you some hard copies to work with.
Yeah,
so to turn around the topic of this discussion, which I think is really interesting, and Marjorie, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to ask both of you a question.
Do.
Question.
You're the chair.
Different hats. But you know, we've talked about what digital poverty is, but I think we've started now to get into what digital wealth could look like. You know, what does digital abundance and riches look like? And just one thing that struck home for me, Ian, was that I think that a part of digital wealth could well actually be that, you know, digital is not the only thing that you have available. That paper is available. It's one part of an ecosystem of things, and this is why the kind of government's plans of making appointments online by default. Is that a sign of digital wealth, or is that a sign of, you know, of withdrawing investment elsewhere? That does it end up in a poorer situation than it was? And so, yeah, I'd love to know what both your thoughts were on, you know, on what is digital abundance.
Okay, but I'm just going to pop in as the chair and say we've got a minute each max because we're over time. But Ian, on you go, because it's a great question, I think, and we'll leave it on that.
It's a brilliant question, and I'll go back to what the young people have told us. You know, so young people savvy know what they've told us to be able to learn is they want access. They want one platform because, you know, schools were giving 3 or 4 or 5. Yeah. They want paper to be able to work in offline because they don't want to be online all the time. You know, they couldn't do stuff on their phone. So the short answer for me is choice. As a user, give them the choice and whatever's appropriate. So that's the headline. So, and Rich, I think you're absolutely right. We're pushing some things online that are going to make those that are further away from it even further away. We need to give the user the power, give the individual, the communities the power, give them all the tools and then give them the choice.
Yeah, and for me, I would say it's access as well. I would say the ones that we work with just need a basket of possibilities. So if they're stuck at home, if they're ill, if they're shielding in the case of COVID, they need to be able to access and make connections with their family and friends, which will be enough to sustain them. Probably not dissimilar in some ways to a refugee situation. But in other instances, they don't want it, so not to force that, So I think it's the danger and the difficulty with this is that everybody's situation is different and everybody's situation is changing. So, it's a bit like trying to provide a one-stop fix-it. We can't do it. So we just have to provide the opportunities to connect with other people and then say, when you feel willing, able, and confident enough to go out and meet other people, then you can do it. But actually, until then, if you're stuck in a prison cell, if you're stuck in a care home, in your room indefinitely because you're not allowed to meet, congregate, or have your meals with other people, or if you're just frightened, if you're feeling vulnerable and frightened for whatever reason to go out, here are some tools that will help you. And here is a way for us to help you make use of those tools, which I think is the big part for us, to have the confidence to use those tools. So it's tricky because it's a basket, but it's really about access so that if it's available, people can tap into it. So I think that's what digital wealth looks like to me. So that's a great question. I think, unless you want to answer it as well, I think we should probably leave it there. Have you got the fix-it for that one?
I've got one quick thing, and it come back to something that you said earlier, Marjorie, which is who are in the digital landscape, who are our guides? And I think community is an important part of digital wealth. That a community that can help guide you to educational resources, cultural resources, where digital is an accentuation of that community. And I think that that's going to be a really, really interesting thing in that. And we're working with some big local groups around the country about how to get. Hopefully, we can work with them on how to get their communities better connected as well. And yeah, I think the combination of community and digital is really powerful.
Yeah, great. Well, great. Thank you for that question. And I think we should leave it there, but I want to say thank you to you both for your insights and knowledge and positivity, which could have been a really negative conversation. So positivity about what's possible and what we should be seeing. And before I go, I just want to say thank you again to our sponsors, but also to highlight a couple of events that are a part of the Citizen program that you should check out. One is called Power to the People, and it's about how lots of our community organizations have had to shift during COVID and create new programs and how they're supporting the people around them. The other is a terrific event, which is a Citizen virtual community meal, where our Scran community group is putting together a meal, and I think they were actually sending out ingredients or meals to people, but you can also get the recipes online and then log in and join in with everybody else eating together in a big virtual community meal, which is terrific. So we hope you join us for those. I just want to say thanks again for joining us. Thanks to Rich and Iain, and thanks hugely to our supporters and patrons and sponsors who have made this festival free and able for everyone who wants to join us, including places like prisons and in hospitals. It's being beamed into all sorts of wonderful places through the support of our donors. So thank you for that. And if you've enjoyed it and want to support us, please support the Edinburgh International Festival by donating on their website. But thank you very much for joining us. Thanks, Rich. Thanks, Iain, for the conversation. I hope to meet you in person soon.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marjorie. Thank you.